A father and daughter disappear on a ski holiday. A drowned man surfaces in the sea. Two mysterious events, 3,500 miles apart, seemingly unconnected, but secretly linked to the master plan of one devious criminal. It will take crime fighters from 4 countries to piece it together and make him pay for his crimes. Jurisdiction, the world. When crimes are committed, an international organization unites police officers to deliver justice. Interpol investigates. December 1990. A crime of international proportions begins with one suburban family. In Brantford, Canada, 65 miles southwest of Toronto. Barbara Walker allows her 15-year-old daughter to spend the holidays skiing with her ex-husband in Switzerland, where both father and daughter vanish without a trace.
Our last conversation was about a health problem that I was having, and I was worried that it was going to be diagnosed as cancer. That was our last conversation before she disappeared.
The holidays pass, and her ex-husband and daughter do not return.
Yeah, this is a picture of them. This is the last picture I took.
After countless attempts to reach them, Barbara goes to the Brantford police to report them missing.
Just let me know, okay?
It felt very hopeless because in another country far away, how would I ever even begin to find them?
And the distressing news keeps coming. Over $700,000 has vanished from the accounts of Walker Financial Services, the company owned by Barbara's ex-husband, Albert. For more than 10 years, Walker Financial has invested millions of dollars in savings and retirement accounts for its clients.
The offices were besieged with phone calls, and then people who came down, I'm given to understand.
Reporter Bill Schiller from the Toronto Star newspaper.
There was a sense of panic because people had invested their life savings, and some of them, quite frankly, were rather elderly. And this represented everything that they had been able to save in life.
Canadian investigators determined that Albert Walker made credit card purchases in Switzerland and never used his return tickets from Zurich. They notify Interpol.
Hello? Fine. Good to hear from you.
John Imhoff, former director of Interpol's U.S. office.
Yes, that was... All an officer has to do is call and establish for the Interpol Bureau in Ottawa that he is a law enforcement officer and that he needs assistance in the matter, and Interpol can act on it.
Interpol issues an international missing persons report called a Yellow Notice for Albert and Amanda Walker. They'll stay on the case until father and daughter are found.
Many notices are decades old. That's not uncommon. But Interpol will be there to render its assistance, that is, keep that notice pending as long as the investigator needs Interpol to pursue the matter.
Only Interpol can connect what happens 3,500 miles away off the southern coast of Devon, England. A trawler fisherman hauls up his catch from the bottom of the ocean. He is shocked to find, entangled in his nets, a human body. Her Majesty's Coast Guard receives the distress call. They escort the boat back to Brixham Harbor. Detective Constable Ian Clenahan heads to the scene. He expects the victim to be a young man who had disappeared off the coast a week earlier in a boating accident.
His body at that stage hadn't been recovered, and it was certainly a consideration that the body that had been trawled up by the fishing boat could have been, at that stage, the body of this young lad.
But the facts don't quite add up.
I went onto the boat and found a male body. It was fully clothed.
The victim seems older, and his body looks to have been in the ocean for some time.
I found that there was no identification on him. Pockets were pulled out of the trousers.
Detective Clenahan wonders if this could be a robbery victim, but the dead man still wears what appears to be a Rolex watch.
We didn't know whether it was a genuine Rolex or whether it was, of course, a fake.
Either way, the watch could provide a clue.
I examined the wristwatch on the boat and noted that the time had stopped at 11:35, and the date window on the watch was showing the number 22.
Clenahan also notices a blurred, star-shaped tattoo on the victim's hand. When the medical examiner arrives, Detective Clenahan points out a deep gash on the back of the victim's head. Devon police bring the body to the pathology lab. The first order of business, raising fingerprints. Not so easy on a body that spent a long time in the water.
The skin of the hands become wrinkled, and it's extremely difficult to get fingerprints of a hand like that.
But forensic pathologist Dr. Guyan Fernando manages to lift a usable print. The frigid waters of the English Channel helped preserve the fragile body. He discovers 3 injuries, a bruise on the hip, and a second bruise on the middle of the thigh that he concludes occurred after death. The timing of the 3rd injury, a deep gash to the back of the head, presents more of a mystery. It could have been inflicted before or after death. But the lungs clearly indicate that this man died from drowning.
At that stage, I had only the few injuries to go on, and they didn't make any sense. It's common to find injuries in people who had drowned, and at that time, I couldn't really say that this was a homicide.
The forensic techs place the victim's few personal effects in a bag. The doctor grapples with another mystery: the victim's time of death. After several days at sea, it's impossible to estimate.
All I could say that he's been in the water for a week or 2.
Not much to go on. 3 injuries of unknown cause, no identification, and no way of knowing how the man drowned. The pathologist freezes the body in case it requires further examination. Devon authorities run the fingerprints through their database of known criminals. They find no match. Days go by. Another body surfaces in the waters near Brixham Harbor. The Coast Guard determines that this was the young man from the boating accident. It has no connection with the previous John Doe. The first body lying in the morgue remains a mystery that demands a solution.
What we have to do is try our utmost to identify who the dead person was and to find out how exactly that person came to die.
Clenaghan learns that the victim's Rolex watch might hold the answer. Rolex keeps records for each of its timepieces. If the owner ever had it serviced, the company would have his name on file. Investigators send the watch to Rolex headquarters in Kent, England. But going through the victim's clothing, Detective Clenaghan discovers another important clue.
And in amongst those clothing, we found that a lot of the labels originated from Canadian manufacturers.
By now, more than 5 years have passed since Barbara Walker's ex-husband and her daughter left Canada, bound for their Switzerland ski holiday, and disappeared.
It was hard to handle. If you thought about it too much, you could lose your mind.
Barbara's hope never wavers. She tries not to imagine the worst, believing that her daughter and ex-husband will somehow be found.
I can't imagine what it would be like to be in her shoes in this situation. Tragic, a mother, I imagine that it would be very difficult.
2 cases on 2 continents. A desperate family tragedy. And a body pulled from the sea. Seemingly unrelated. But investigators will soon find them linked to a large and cunning criminal plot. 2 random tragedies, or so it seems. In Canada, a father takes his daughter on holiday to Europe, and they never return. In England, a fisherman pulls a dead man from the sea. Eventually, authorities will connect them and reveal the mastermind behind it all. But for now, investigators work them as separate cases, counting on timing, luck, and thorough detective work. In Devon, England, Detective Ian Clenaghan tries to solve the case of the dead man pulled from the sea. The victim's watch has a serial number that could identify its owner.
So we sent the Rolex off to the Rolex company head office in England, where it was examined, and we were eventually informed that that particular Rolex watch had been serviced 3 times, all in the Harrogate area of England in Yorkshire, and the name of the person that put the watch in for service on all 3 occasions was Mr. Neil Barrett.
Neil Barrett. Investigators' first lead on the identity of the man in the morgue. His last known address was in Chelmsford, northwest of London, and a 5-hour drive from Devon. Detective Clenaghan asks a colleague there to help out.
So my role was to go to Chelmsford and establish if anyone there knew the chap.
Detective Sergeant Peter Redman finds Barrett's rental house empty and calls upon Barrett's landlord.
Yes, Detective Peter Redman. Just wanted to inquire.
And he told me that Neil had given up the house and had moved to France to set himself up in business.
The landlord gives the detective a copy of Neil Barrett's lease. On it, Barrett listed a man named Steve Russell as a reference. Detective Redman calls Steve Russell, authorities' only link to the deceased. Their only hope.
The purpose of my meeting with Steve Russell was to see if there was anything else about Neil that he could tell us that would assist the identification. Because as I understood it, the body wasn't in a fit state to be viewed by a friend. We sat and talked for a while. Nice chap. Well-spoken, well-dressed, casually, but very well-dressed. Expensive clothes. He'd got an air of confidence about him. There was an accent, but I couldn't detect. It was North American, whether it was American or Canadian, I couldn't tell. I wanted to know when he'd last seen him, and if he knew at that time what his plans were, because we couldn't explain how he would be travelling to France and winding up in the sea off Devon.
Steve Russell can't explain his friend's deadly twist of fate, but he offers some useful information. He recalls that Neil had served in the army.
They were able to provide Neil's medical and dental records, which were forwarded to Devon and Cornwall, and they were able to match the dental records.
Barrett has been positively identified. Police find no further evidence of foul play. Detective Redmond believes the case is wrapping up.
They had identified the body. There was no sign of any third-party involvement in his death. It was being treated as an accident, a drowning.
But what investigators don't realize is that this case is just getting started. Detective Clenahan notifies Barrett's brother of Neil's death. Barrett's brother tells Clenahan that the tattoo is a Canadian maple leaf. He asks Clenahan to put him in touch with Steve Russell, hoping that Russell can help him find his brother's belongings. Clenahan calls on Detective Peter Redmond again to ask him to visit Russell in the small farming village where he lives. In rural England, houses often have no street addresses. Instead, they're given names. At first, Detective Redmond can't locate it.
I found the two houses, neither of which had got names on them. So I took pot luck and I called it, as it turned out, the neighbours. I said who I was and that I was looking for Steve Russell. And he said, oh no, Neil Barrett lives there. And I'm thinking straight away, something's not right here. That's the name of the man who's dead in Devon.
About how long have they lived next door to you?
Redmond learns what the neighbors know about this other Neil Barrett. He discovers an uncanny similarity between Neil Barrett and Steve Russell.
And when they described the person they knew as Neil, his manner, the accent, it became apparent to me that we were talking about the same person but with two different names.
Redmond realizes that Steve Russell is pretending to be Neil Barrett.
What they'd said transformed what had been a simple investigation to identify a found body to potentially a murder investigation. The man I was seeking was living as this man's identity. There had to be something sinister in my mind, and had Neil met his end as a consequence of this.
On his way back to the station, Redmond calls Detective Ian Clenahan in Devon with the news.
Detective Clenahan.
He informed me of his findings at Wood and Walter, which really threw a totally different light on the matter.
But investigators haven't begun to fathom the depths of deceit involved in this case, or to suspect the international criminal at the bottom of it. In Canada, people have begun to realize the Albert Walker case is much more complicated than it originally seemed. Right after Walker disappeared with his daughter, money disappeared from his company. And now, it appears that Walker had plundered his own corporation.
I found bank information indicating that large amounts of money were being transferred through his personal bank account. I knew it wasn't his own money because we didn't have that kind of money. So it had to be either money that he was taking from the company or taking it from clients.
Hello?
He had left his wife to deal with the clients who are obviously extremely upset. It was a shock to people that someone like this, who seemed to be righteous and good and charming and generous, could actually disappear and leave people high and dry without their life savings.
Canadian police charge Walker with 19 counts of theft, fraud, and money laundering. They request that Interpol issue a red notice for Albert Walker. He will rise to number 4 on Interpol's most wanted list.
The red notice is like an electronic version of the wanted notice that we used to see in the post office. Interpol will send that out to 181 countries so that if this subject comes to their attention, they can take steps to see that he's apprehended and returned to face justice in Canada.
But Walker will be very hard to locate. When he left Canada, he shed his identity.
I think he was difficult to track because you're dealing with a very cunning criminal mind. Mr. Walker was not a deeply intelligent man. He was not an intellectual. But when it came to crime, he was dangerously clever.
Maybe too clever for his own good. Because now, Albert Walker has the full force of Interpol gunning for him. That leaves him with no place to hide. Off the coast of Devon, England, an anonymous dead body is pulled from the sea. Eventually, dental records identify him as Neil Barrett. But this case is not so simple. Someone has taken Barrett's life and stolen his identity. Detective Peter Redman has even met the impostor. He introduced himself as Steve Russell. Police soon learn that Steve Russell lives with his young wife and 2 small children. In Canada, the name Steve Russell means nothing, yet. Barbara Walker is more concerned about the capture of her ex-husband, Albert Walker, number 4 on Interpol's most wanted list. But during the Canadian police investigation into Albert Walker, they meet the real Steve Russell, one of Walker's former clients.
He told the police that he had gone to Mr. Walker for a loan. Mr. Walker said that he would be able to facilitate that. And in doing so, he said, he would need his birth certificate.
With that one slip of paper, an experienced criminal can steal an identity.
He needed another identity, and Mr. Walker did just that. There were 2 key things that he did extremely well. He kept moving, and he kept moving under different personalities. And he got the necessary documentation, the official papers, that he needed to in order to be convincing.
Using Steve Russell's identity, Albert Walker starts a new life in England. 3 years later, fearful that Canadian investigators will catch up with him, he takes on yet another identity, Neil Barrett.
We started over the next few weeks to investigate the house, and we checked on all the utilities, the gas, the electric, the water. And we found that all of these items were registered in the name of Neil Barrett.
Both of them.
Police find the children's birth certificates are also registered under the name Barrett.
The only piece we can find on Russell.
But the real Neil Barrett is lying in the morgue in Devon. He has no wife and lived alone.
If these aren't the
But he did have an ex-girlfriend named Melinda, who became an unwitting pawn in a murderous master plan. Detective Clenahan tracks her down.
Hello, hi. When did you first meet Steve Russell?
Melinda worked for the man police know as Steve Russell. She bought antiques and property, traveling around the continent for him. But that isn't all she did.
She was also asked by Mr. Russell to take vast quantities of money over into Europe and deposit them in various banks in Switzerland and other similar countries.
She never questioned where the money came from. Russell wins her trust completely.
I introduced
Melinda introduces her boyfriend, Neil Barrett, to her boss.
from Canada.
Can we get you a drink?
She informed Mr. Russell at the time that her boyfriend, Mr. Neil Barrett, had one great ambition in life, which was to emigrate to Canada.
Russell makes Melinda and Neil business partners, setting the trap. To complete the paperwork, he asks for their identification papers, including birth certificates.
It was wonderful to work with him together.
They have no reason to be suspicious of Russell. After all, he's exceedingly generous.
One Christmas, they were round at Mr. Russell's home address when Mr. Russell gave Mr. Barrett and Melinda 2 one-way tickets to Canada.
What they don't know is that Russell needs Barrett out of the country for a reason. He wants the man's identity. The trap is sprung. Steve Russell becomes Neil Barrett. But things don't quite work out as planned.
We left together really thinking that it was
Neil and Melinda break up. Melinda moves back home.
it wasn't.
And soon enough, a letter arrives in Steve Russell's mailbox. Neil Barrett has decided to come home as well. Steve Russell finds himself in an impossible situation.
The problems came when Neil Barrett decided to return to England, and then there were 2 Neil Barretts living in close proximity.
How are you? I'm good.
Clenahan suspects that gave the imposter a motive to kill Barrett.
We decided at that time that we would arrest both Mr. Russell and his wife, Diane Russell, on suspicion of the murder of Neil Barrett.
According to the neighbors, Russell and his family are out of town. But Detective Peter Redmond decides to drive by to see for himself. He is surprised to see a car in the driveway. But the detective is alone, without backup.
And I phoned, said, the car's back. I'm not going to leave in case they take flight. It was then suggested, well, we don't really know who this person is. He's wanted for murder. Someone suggested there might be firearms involved.
In Great Britain, police almost never carry a pistol. And armed raids require special arrangement. Redman is told to sit tight until headquarters can mount an operation. While the detective waits for the firearms team to arrive, a taxi approaches the house. And the man he knows as Steve Russell gets in. With or without backup, Redman cannot let the suspect slip from his grasp.
So I decided to follow it and to get it stopped.
Redman is alone and unarmed. He can only pursue his mark and hope that backup will arrive before it's too late.
I got on the telephone and explained to them what was happening, that I was following this taxi and I believed it had got our suspect in it. So they frantically tried to get the armed response vehicle, which in fact was some distance behind me, to catch us up. And eventually, I would imagine 2 to 3 miles from the house, they finally caught up and stopped him.
Police approach the arrest cautiously. They know Steve Russell is a desperate man about to be cornered. In England, a fishing boat snares a dead body. Police discover that a man named Steve Russell has stolen the dead man's identity. They arrest him on suspicion of murder. Detective Peter Redman takes him in. Russell plays it cool.
So I walked up to him and he recognised me straight away.
Sergeant Peter Redman, the Yorkshire Police. What's it all about? We're placing you under arrest for the murder of Neil Barrett.
He was completely compliant. He put his hands behind his back in readiness for them to handcuff him. And then they took him away in their patrol car.
Mr. Russell is a very cool, calm and calculated killer. He's a very, very ruthless man and would do anything to meet his ends.
At Russell's house, Redman and his associates find the rest of the family. His wife Diane and 2 children. They take the young mother in for questioning.
She seemed a little taken aback, but there was no hysterics or panic. She's all about the children. Now, while Diane was getting herself ready and the children, the female officer who was with her noticed the small rucksack that she was preparing for the toddler. And said, "Wait a minute, what have you got in there?" And when she opened the bag, she discovered several bars of gold and several £1,000s in cash. Just what a 3-year-old needs for a night away.
The man at the center of the mystery won't cooperate.
Just got a couple of questions.
It's very difficult to give someone an opinion of a person who answers no comment to every question they're answered.
I have no comment on that. No comment.
But he appeared to me to be a very calm, very calculated person, very sure of himself.
Police question Diane Russell separately.
She answered all our questions, and she informed us that Stephen Russell was a very successful businessman and that he had fled America in order that his wife, who he had now split up from, couldn't get half of his earnings from the business, and that was why they were over here.
The police search Russell's house, hoping to find evidence to turn their suspicions to proof.
At this point, we still didn't have any hard fact at all. And in fact, really, we were struggling to say that Mr. Barrett had actually been murdered.
Investigators find more cash and gold bars. They also uncover various documents, including a rental agreement for a self-storage facility.
So we checked a lot of this and we found notes with yours.
A search of the storage unit yields a global positioning satellite device, or GPS, used to navigate boats.
GPS we issue is all found out.
The suspect has a boat registered under Barrett's name. Police locate it at the pier in Devon. They impound and search it. On board, they find a bag with credit card receipts, including one from a nautical supply store. The credit card is also in the name of Neil Barrett. Police question the owner of the nautical supply store. He tells them that the receipt is for an anchor. He recalls the customer insisted on buying the anchor, even when told it was too small for his boat. The store owner describes the purchaser. He fits the description of the suspect known as Steve Russell. Detective Clenahan knows he must find the missing anchor. He re-interviews the trawler fisherman who discovered the body.
He informed us that in fact an anchor had been trawled up in the same nets as Mr. Barrett.
The fisherman had forgotten all about it. He was, after all, focused on the discovery of the body. Clenahan knows the anchor could provide crucial evidence of murder. Pathologist Guyan Fernando has frozen the victim's remains. When the police bring the anchor to the morgue, he can re-examine the body in light of this new evidence. Dr. Fernando determines that the bruises on the thigh and the hip seem consistent with the anchor's shape. He concludes that the killer used the anchor to weigh the body down.
And immediately, the police and myself thought this must have been hooked onto the belt.
Yes. In here.
Dr. Fernando believes the anchor pulled away from the body when it got caught up in the trawler's net.
Might I see the belt, please?
So we took the belt out and had a look. And where we thought the anchor must have been hooked, the belt showed definite evidence of twisting.
They bring the belt and the anchor to the lab. The anchor is coated with zinc. Forensic investigators discover traces of zinc on the belt, providing the evidence they need to classify this death as a murder. They theorize that the killer knocked Neil Barrett unconscious on the boat, weighted him down with the anchor, and threw him overboard. The police know a murder occurred. Now they must link it to the suspected murderer. Using Neil Barrett's card, Steve Russell purchased the anchor. But investigators need to place him at the scene of the crime. The GPS device recovered from his storage locker could be the smoking gun they're looking for. They send it to the manufacturer to determine where the GPS system has traveled recently.
Very interestingly, this put that GPS system out at sea at 9 p.m. on the 21st of July, 6 miles off Teignmouth, which was roughly where the body was trawled up from.
This is consistent with the date on the watch found on the body, the 22nd. A Rolex will self-wind for up to 44 hours before it stops. Time has run out for Steve Russell, on the hook for murder. But he is not the man authorities think he is, and his crimes go far deeper than they ever imagined. British police arrest North American Steve Russell, believing he murdered Neil Barrett to steal his identity. But through Interpol's fingerprint database, they are about to discover they've solved an international case that has stymied investigators for years. Whenever a foreign suspect is arrested, authorities send the fingerprints to the Interpol database to see if the suspect has committed crimes abroad. In fact, Interpol does have a match. But the fingerprints do not belong to a man named Stephen Russell. He is not the man authorities think he is. And his crimes go far deeper than they ever imagined.
Within a few hours, a reply came back that, in fact, Mr. Stephen Russell wasn't Stephen Russell, but was, in fact, Albert Johnson Walker, a man that featured very prominently on Interpol's most wanted list.
Albert Walker, the same man who left Canada 6 years earlier to escape fraud charges. The same man who disappeared with his teenage daughter.
We had caught the fourth most wanted man in the world. We were all obviously very thrilled.
In Brantford, Canada, Barbara Walker has not seen her daughter in 6 years. Ever since her husband Albert disappeared with the young girl. Finally, she receives the call she has longed for.
This is Detective Myers from the Ontario Provincial Police. I'm calling to inform you.
My knees went weak. I thought this is unbelievable. They were saying that my daughter was found, that she was okay. And it was just after all those years of hoping, and it came out of the blue.
British authorities uncover that the woman posing as Russell's wife is really Barbara Walker's kidnapped daughter.
Open number 6.
An older man with a younger wife is not unusual, but an older man with a younger woman who, when you look closely, has got physical resemblances to him, then you start to think, I wonder what's going on here.
This is a particularly difficult situation because you're talking about a child-parent relationship, and the concept of free will as we know it breaks down somewhat in that equation. Certainly you're a victim in that instance.
His daughter came over them at 15 years of age. Mr. Walker was a very manipulative man. He manipulated many lives that he came across daily and ruined people's lives. It didn't matter whether it was a friend or family, he didn't care.
Though many have speculated about the identity of the children's father, the paternity has never been revealed. British social service counselors arrange and monitor the first meeting between Barbara and her daughter.
I was shaking when I went into the room, but it went well. It was awkward, of course, when you haven't spoken with someone in 6 years. We sort of had to reintroduce ourselves.
It was when that spell was broken, the contact with her father was broken. She was then able to come forward and tell what had really happened. And it became apparent that she was not a suspect, she was a victim.
In time, Amanda Walker agrees to testify against her father. Albert Walker will finally have to answer for the death of Neil Barrett.
It seems like the perfect murder. And for all intents and purposes, he should have got away with it.
The Rolex watch found on Barrett's body, the clue that gave police the dead man's identity is where the case came together for police and unraveled for the con man.
Had he even taken the watch off and thrown it perhaps 60 or 70 yards, just simply disengaged it from the body, he'd be a free man today.
And were it not for Interpol, the identity of the murderer would have forever remained a mystery.
The fingerprints were the key issue. I think had the fingerprints not identified him as Albert Walker, I don't think we would ever have found out who he was.
In the end, thank God, Interpol were the people who put together the information, sent it to the United Kingdom, and the investigators finally knew who they were dealing with.
Albert Walker is convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Although finally brought to justice, Walker's ego will not allow him to be humbled.
He was led away in the prison van when one of the prison officers mentioned my name to him. He replied, "Yeah, I know the man. Tall, scouser, not too bright. But I was brighter than Mr. Walker on this occasion."
Albert Walker is serving a life sentence in England. He still faces 37 charges of fraud in Canada.